it'll take a staggering 131 years to close the gender gap. That's the main finding of this year's Global Gender Gap Report by the World Economic Forum. Dr. Silja Baller is Head of Mission at Diversity, Equity and Inclusion for the World Economic Forum. Dr. Baller, good evening to you. It seems that the momentum for gender equality to have the same number of women in powerful positions as men lost momentum during the COVID-19 pandemic. Why did that happen? Why did the pandemic have such an impact?
Yes, hello and good evening, and thank you so much for having us on the program. Maybe before we dive into the results of this year's Global Gender Gap Report, let me just say a couple of words about how we define the Global Gender Gap. So there are 4 dimensions that we look at, including education, as well as health and survival, political empowerment, and economic participation. And this is indeed a global report where we're looking at 146 countries, and we've been doing this since 2006. So 17 years of data. And there is a slight cause of optimism, but only slight. So we have recovered in terms of the overall level of parity to the pre-pandemic level of just over 2/3. However, as you already mentioned, the pace of progress has slowed down significantly. And so while we saw in the pandemic year a drop in the years that it will take to reach parity from 100 years to over 130 years, we've still not recovered this. So currently at 131 years. And indeed, the political empowerment dimension remains by far the largest gaps, with only 20% of the gender gap closed here.
Sure. If we keep going at this rate, it'll be over a century before my daughter has the same life chances as my son. Is there any chance that the rate of change is actually going to speed up? Are we likely to see it speeding up, and maybe in some places, hopefully, quite quickly?
Indeed, I mean, there are many governments and many companies are already taking action. But I think given the current rate at which we're moving and given the slowdown that we've seen during the pandemic, there is indeed a need to step up efforts significantly. And I think the first step change will be to really recognize gender parity as being core to economic progress, core to growth, core to innovation, and some of the key economic indicators that we're looking at. We are seeing some progress with governments mainstreaming gender parity, with governments looking at their budgets and thinking about to what extent are certain budget allocations impacting gender parity, and to what extent can we allocate budgets in a way that proactively supports gender parity. We're also seeing more attention being paid to the care economy, which is, of course, a big issue given the systematic gender gaps that we're seeing across every level of labor markets. And we're also seeing companies at the frontier take action and moving away from an approach where they're just looking at what can we do in terms of the workforce, to looking at all the levers that they have available across the business, and that can help improve gender parity, and that includes things like supply chains, that includes innovation processes, for example, branding and marketing, really the full scale. So these are some of the avenues that some governments and some companies are already pursuing, but we will need to see a massive step change in order for the next generation of women and girls to be better off.
Dr. Baller, when you talk about the care economy, you mean the fact that women generally, in almost all societies, particularly in ours, I must say, end up having to care for children and other members of the family, whereas men generally don't.
Indeed, and we've seen, especially during the pandemic, when the formal care system broke down, when the privately provided care, or the care provided by the private sector and by the public sector, when those institutions shut down, we saw most of this work being shifted to women, which had significant impact on the labor force, on labor force participation in the first instance. And interestingly, at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw both mothers and fathers step out of the labor force and take on care responsibilities potentially. However, a few months into the pandemic, it was the fathers who had returned to the workforce, whereas the mothers were still not returning to the workforce, which should suggest that care indeed was one of the big bottlenecks and one of the big explanators as to why we saw regressions in terms of economic participation of women in the last few years.
In South Africa, we've seen more progress in the last 30 years, I mean dramatic progress in 30 years. in terms of women's position in society, the number of women members of parliament, the number of women in cabinet, for example. But we still have a deeply patriarchal society. We're still a long way from true parity, true equality for women. What sort of big interventions can a society like ours make to speed up this process?
So indeed, as you're saying, South Africa ranks 20th out of 146 countries in this year's edition of the Global Gender Gap Report, which is very high in the rankings, and third in the region. If we go back to the dimensions that we mentioned by which we define the gender gap, we see that South Africa ranks very highly and has a very high score in terms of educational parity as well as health and survival. As you mentioned, parity is also high by global levels in terms of political empowerment, where South Africa has closed almost 50% of the gap compared to a global average of just above 20%. But where there's really an opportunity to boost gender parity is in terms of economic participation and opportunity. So we see South Africa doing really well in terms of parity for technical workers. There's also solid labor force participation, or solid scores for gender parity and labor force participation, as well as estimated earned income. However, there are fairly large gaps in terms of how women are remunerated for doing comparable work, and there's also a gap in terms of representation of women in senior leadership. So those are two areas. If there's investment in those two areas, that would boost indeed South Africa's gender parity performance.
Dr. Silja Baller, thank you. Head of Mission for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at the World Economic Forum. Really appreciate the time tonight.